Our purpose for creating the cremation video is obviously to give you a tool that you can use to reach out to families and to help your funeral home owners deal with a ever increasing cremation percentage in their funeral home. One of the reasons that we wanted to create it was so that we could reach families before death has occurred. I heard for the last couple of years from so many funeral home owners that they were seeing families walk in the door and look them in the eye and say, "Mom said she just wanted to be cremated." And so they were having to work on the back end, trying to get families in their emotional grief to understand the value of celebrating Mom's life, even if Mom told them she wanted to be cremated. By doing a cremation seminar, we're able to meet with families prior to death so that we can explain to them the value of having a celebration of life and planning it out in advance so that their children know exactly what they want done. That way the kids aren't walking into the funeral home after death has occurred and saying, "Mom just said she wanted to be cremated." They walk in with a knowledge in their mind and in their heart that Mom wanted to be cremated, yes, but Mom also wanted a celebration of her life, and she had planned it out in advance. By using this video, you can learn how to make a presentation to families that will help them understand the value of celebrating their life while still having the cremation that they desire. I will hope you use it in the spirit that it was created, and if you have any questions, I hope that you'll give me a call. Thanks for watching. I want to talk about what we're going to be trying to accomplish here today. In the next 30 to 35 minutes, what we're going to try to do is help you better understand how cremation fits into the memorialization process. We're going to talk about why many families today are opting for funeral services that include cremation. We're going to provide some ideas for your personal cremation options. And then we're going to describe the 3 essential elements of a healing funeral tribute that includes cremation. And when we're done, I hope, first of all, you'll be able to decide if cremation is the right choice for you and your family. And if cremation is right for you, that you'll be able to work with your family and a funeral professional to design a meaningful healing tribute that includes cremation. And if when we're done here today, you decide that cremation isn't right for you, you will have options to consider when thinking about burial. I know I tried to put myself in your shoes before I came in today and try to anticipate what questions you might ask. First of all, let's start with the obvious. Why do people have funerals anyway? What exactly is cremation? When someone says, "I want to be cremated," what exactly do they mean? Why is there so much talk about cremation? What's so special about it? You may be here today and you're not even sure if you want to be cremated or not. So you're probably wondering, what should I know to help me decide? Are there any pitfalls I need to know about? Are there any unintended consequences? Can I still have a funeral if I choose to be cremated? You may be wondering about that. And then, of course, there's the big question. What's the right amount of money to spend? Honestly, has anybody been thinking about that? Sure, we all have. Now, you've probably got other questions on your mind, and I want to make sure that we get to those at the conclusion of our time here together. In your pad, you have a note page. On the note page, if a question comes to your mind, just write it down, and we'll have a time today before we leave that you can ask those questions. Or if you feel like you just need to, shout it out, and we'll answer it as we go along. Is that fair enough? Let me tell you a little bit about myself before we begin. I've been in the funeral profession for over 17 years, helping families arrange their funerals and plan meaningful tributes for their family members. I speak to folks all across the country about the importance of a funeral tribute, whether cremation or burial is the means for disposition. I'm a partner at West Oaks Funeral Home in Sulphur Springs, Texas. That gives me a unique perspective on what families go through when there's been a death in the family. All right, now that you know a little bit about me, let's get started. What exactly is cremation? I think that's a good place to start. You know, if you Google the word cremation, here's probably what you're going to find. The remains of a person and the container encasing the remains are exposed to extreme heat and flame, which results in the reduction of the body to bone fragments, which are then processed to a uniform size and consistency. How many of you have ever heard the term ashes? Sure, we all have heard that term. But here's what's interesting. They are really not ashes. What's left after cremation are the minerals in the bones and in the teeth that do not burn. And many times those bone fragments are so large that they're identifiable. So what they do is they take them out of the cremation chamber. So they call it the retort. And then they put them in a mechanical processor, which reduces them to a fine dust, which then can fit inside an urn. That's what cremation is. And cremation is one form of final disposition. Burial is the other. You know, when you're born, the government issues you a birth certificate. And you're not really considered a legal person by the government until that's done. When you die, the government issues you a death certificate. Now, once death has been certified to have happened by the government, there's only two ways that dead human bodies leave this world. They're either buried or they're cremated. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, well, you know what? I think I'll just give my body to science and skip all of this. Well, and that's okay, but you need to understand something. Once the medical school is through with your body, guess what they're going to do with it? Yeah, they're going to cremate it or they're going to bury it. And you also need to remember, final disposition does not address memorialization issues. It's just that. It's the legal disposition of a dead human body. So, why are so many people choosing cremation? Why is it seemingly becoming more popular each and every day? Well, let me tell you what we hear at the funeral home. Some people say they're choosing cremation because, first of all, they view it as simpler. They just want a simple funeral and they want a simple cremation. They want to skip all the fuss. Some people tell us that they view it as environmentally friendly. They've been told that cemeteries are filling up, but you need to know that's not the case. But yet still people think it's environmentally friendly. Some people view it as less expensive. And it can be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Sometimes people have large, complex funeral services followed by cremation. Some people just say, I don't want a funeral. What we've learned at the funeral home, that most people who say that, they have never been part of a well thought out, well planned funeral tribute. Some people will say, well, you've all heard the term earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Most of these people just don't like the idea of being buried. And then many people today are choosing a celebration of life ceremony. What these people don't want is they don't want grandma's sad, boring, cookie-cutter funeral. They want something uplifting. They want to do something that makes people feel better when they leave the service than they did when they came. People just don't want sad, boring funerals anymore. But did you know that for whatever reason you're choosing cremation, much or all of the same can be accomplished with burial? For example, you can have a simple funeral service followed by a very simple ground burial. A ground burial can be environmentally friendly. You can use a biodegradable casket. You don't even have to be embalmed. And what's more environmentally friendly than a cemetery? You've got green space after green space after green space. Nothing more green than a cemetery. And certainly you can spend less money on ground burial if that's what your desire. If you don't want a funeral, you can have a direct burial. You don't have to be embalmed. And you can use, as I said earlier, a casket that simply breaks down. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And of course, obviously, you can have a celebration of life ceremony followed by ground burial. But again, anything you're trying to accomplish with cremation, you can accomplish with ground burial. So the question this morning is, which is right? Ground burial or cremation? And listen, I have no opinion on whether cremation or burial is the right option for you. Frankly, that's up to you and your family. I can't tell you which is best for you. But I can tell you this. In my opinion, it's the wrong question. But before we get to the right question, let me ask you two more questions. First, what's the purpose of final disposition? Sure, it's to get rid of the body. And it's also for public health reasons. I mean, after all, we can't have dead human bodies lying all over the place. What's the purpose of a funeral tribute? To have closure, to say goodbye, to celebrate a life that's been lived. That's the purpose of a funeral tribute. Final disposition is to get rid of the body. Funeral tribute is to honor and celebrate a life that has been lived. So let's not confuse the two. Let's talk a little bit about designing a tribute. There's 4 things to consider when you're designing a healing tribute that includes cremation. First of all, who has been impacted by the life I've lived? Since funerals are for the living, then we need to start giving some thought about what's going to be done at our funeral service. And how many of you have given any thought to this question? Who comes to mind when I ask you who's been impacted by the life that you've lived? Your family, obviously, your friends, your co-workers, people at church. There's many people that are impacted by the life that we've lived. Who will be impacted by my death? Generally, it's the same people. Your friends, your family, your co-workers, people you play and have games with, people that have lived with and been with all of your life will be impacted by your death. So I want to ask you this morning, what will these people need to aid them during the grieving process? And how can the life that you've lived be reflected in your cremation tribute? Well, let me ask you something. What were funerals like 20 years ago? Yeah, they were basically all the same. You had a funeral service in the chapel of the church, and then you would have a procession to the funeral, to the graveside, and where the body would be interred into the ground. Well, I want you to understand that funerals are changing. People are being more creative today than ever before in designing a tribute. Think for a moment about how weddings have changed over the last 20 years. Let me ask you something. How many of your grandparents got married in a hot air balloon? Did any of your grandparents get married while scuba diving? Did any of your grandparents or even your parents have a destination wedding to Jamaica or Maui? Probably not. And it may not be something that you would do. But honestly, we're not surprised anymore when we see things like this happening and we read about it in the newspaper. Because weddings are changing, and so are funerals. Many people today are choosing to have a funeral that celebrates life. And the reason is they just, again, want people to feel better when they leave the service than they did when they came. What we're striving for is we're trying to balance your personal wishes with what your family needs, and honestly, what your family deserves. We believe that every healing tribute has 3 essential elements. First of all, there's some form of a gathering, preferably public. Then it has a ceremony with religious or spiritual overtones, or one that honors the memory of the person who has died. And finally, there is a procession to a place of final rest. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these in detail. First of all, let's talk about the gathering. A gathering is a place that allows family and friends to give and receive love, comfort, and support one another. By opening this event to the public, it multiplies its effectiveness. How often have you been to a visitation, which is what most of us would call a gathering, and have someone come up to a family member and tell them a story about the deceased that they had never heard before? Obviously, that gives great comfort to the family. You cannot have that unless you have a gathering. A gathering may include one or all of the following. There is a viewing of the deceased. Many times it's public, many times it's private, and sometimes it's optional. Now, when we talk about optional viewing, this is something fairly new, but we're seeing more families adapt it each and every day. This is where you take the deceased body in the casket and put it in a separate room. And then the family is in a room separate from the casket. That way, when family members come or friends come to pay their final respects, if they do not want to view the body, which, hey, some people don't want to, then they don't have to go into the room. But if they do choose to, they can pay their respects to the family, and then they can go see the deceased. So it's an option that you obviously have for your family. At a gathering, you're going to see a display of photos. Hey, everybody likes to look at pictures. It's just something that's comforting to us. So you see a display of mementos and other meaningful items of the person's life. Many times there's a memory sharing time where people will get up and tell stories about the deceased. Sometimes the memorial video tribute is being played. How many of you have seen one of those? It's sort of the modern day picture board. Since I said earlier that spirituality is important to a lot of people, many times you'll hear the speaking of the rosary or a prayer service at a gathering. And then many times there's sharing of food. I mean, after all, we can't get together without having something to eat. And many times families will share the favorite foods of the deceased. It makes the gathering much more personal. Essential element number 2 that we want to talk about is some form of a ceremony with at least some religious or spiritual overtones, or some honoring of the person who has died. You see, a ceremony helps us understand and honor the person who has died and come to grips with the reality of that person's death. When you add the appropriate religious or spiritual elements, it offers hope to the grieving family, and it aids us in our search for meaning. Let's be honest. Many times when someone dies, that's when we all stop and ask ourselves the big questions. Who am I? What am I here for? What is my purpose? And when we ask those questions, for many people, it's their faith that helps them through this most difficult time. And that's why many families will add the religious or spiritual elements to the service. The ceremony may include some or all of the following. First of all, there's a focal point. If you're having a funeral service followed by cremation, you may have the presence of the body in a casket at the service. If you're having a service after the cremation has taken place, then you may have the presence of the cremated body in an urn, or there may be nothing more there than a memorial portrait of the person that has died. Many times there'll be a celebration of life with eulogies or other public reflections. As I said earlier, many times in the ceremony, they will play the memorial video tribute. There'll be special music, and most of the time the special music is the favorite music of the deceased. Let me ask you a question. What kind of music did you hear at funerals 20 years ago? By and large, mostly we heard hymns. Well, today, almost anything and everything is played at a funeral. It's not unusual to have a family come in to our funeral home and hand us an iPod and say, play this. And you may hear anything from the Rolling Stones to the Beatles to Janis Joplin. It's whatever has meaning to the family and helps them deal with the reality of death. And as I said earlier, you may have sacred music and sacred scripture and poems, inspirational quotes that meant something to the deceased. Religious traditions, again, very important. Many people will choose to have military honors for a veteran, may have lodge rights for a Mason. And then people are adding other meaningful things like candle lighting ceremonies, balloon releases, dove releases. Has anyone seen one of those? They're absolutely fascinating, and other meaningful events. And then the third and final element that we need to talk about is some form of procession to a place of final rest. You see, a procession is a strong symbol of unity, support, and acknowledgement that something important has happened. You know, we have another word that we use for procession, and we don't think about it a lot, but let me ask you something. What happens in most communities on July the 4th, or on Memorial Day, or many times the weekend prior to the homecoming football game? Sure, they have a parade. You see, a parade is something that we use to mark important events, to let us remind us of something very important that has happened at some point in the past. A procession, just like a parade, acknowledges that an important event has happened, that someone has lived a successful life and now they've died. And a procession is a way of honoring that life. And many folks today who understand the symbolism of a procession are finding a way to incorporate it into the ceremony. Now, you may be wondering how that would work at a cremation tribute, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. Finally, a procession is going to a place of final rest for the cremated body. That helps provide a point of closure, an understanding of the finality of death, and a place to go in the future to search for meaning. Never underestimate the importance of having a final resting place for the body where people can go, whether it's in an urn or not. A procession to a place of rest may include using pallbearers to carry a cremation casket. It may be asking designated people to carry the urn if the cremation is before the ceremony at certain points. In other words, you may have someone very close to you carry the urn into the church or the chapel and have someone else carry the urn out. It becomes very meaningful. Many times there's a processing from the church or chapel to the crematory. Many crematories today will allow the family to gather there and actually watch their loved one going into the fire. Many times the burial of a cremated body in a cemetery with a procession to the graveside. Now you may be wondering, if I'm choosing cremation, why in the world would I bury the cremated body? And there's many reasons for that. Many times people don't decide they want to be cremated until after they've already purchased their cemetery property. And so they decide just to take advantage of that and bury the cremated body into their own plot. Many times you'll have one spouse decide to be buried and the other one decide to be cremated. And so the one that's cremated may be actually interred in the spot with the one that was buried in the ground. That way they're resting together. Very significant, very meaningful. And then a lot of people today just want to be in a cemetery with all of their other family members. So many people will choose to put the cremated body in a grave. Then there's the placement of the cremated body in a niche, in a columbarium. You know, that's a word we don't use much anymore, columbarium. Here's what it looks like. It looks like a big set of bookshelves, and it'll have little niches in it. Many times they'll have glass fronts. Sometimes they'll have granite fronts. If they have glass, then the cremated urn is placed inside along with other mementos of the family. And then someone can come and have, again, a place of closure that they can go and spend time with the one that they love. Many people place the cremated body in an ossuary. And again, that's a term we don't use much. An ossuary is a place in a cemetery that's a common scattering ground. In other words, many family members will spread the ashes into that particular spot. Normally there's a memorial wall where the name is etched. It gives people a place to go in the future to search for meaning. Many times the procession will include military honors, and a lot of times there'll be religious traditions or spiritual overtones. A procession to a place of final rest may include placing the cremated body in an urn to be kept at home. Now, a lot of people tell me, boy, Leon, that's weird. I'm not keeping grandma at home. But the more people think about it, many people choose to do just that. Many times there'll be a burial or scattering of the cremated body on private property with permission. It's very important that you understand that you cannot take these ashes and put them on private property that's not yours without permission. But make sure that you get that permission before you scatter the ashes. Many times people want to bury or scatter the cremated body elsewhere. By elsewhere, I mean on public property. Let me go back to the very beginning when I was talking about the body when it's being cremated. Once the body has been cremated, it no longer has legal standing. And if it no longer has legal standing, guess what it becomes? It becomes the personal property of the next of kin. Now let me ask you a question. Can you take your personal property and throw it on someone else's property? Well, the answer obviously is no. So you want to make sure that if you're scattering on public property, that you follow the laws of the community in which you live. But honestly, I've never seen anybody thrown in jail for scattering the cremated body from an airplane or on public waters. But you still want to make sure that you get permission if it's needed. Sometimes people want to divide the cremated body and place it in little miniature urns or memorial jewelry. It's a big urn is about this size, and then you have a smaller urn about this size. And if you have many family members who would like a piece of the cremated body, what the funeral home will do is simply put a little bit of the cremated body in each one of the miniature urns so that all of the children have a piece of mom or dad nearby. And you say, oh, that sounds kind of strange. And I hear that a lot. But you know, the more people give it thought, we see more and more people choosing to do just that so that everyone has a part of mom or dad at home with them. And then there's other creative and meaningful ideas. I mean, if you want to spend the money today, you could have your husband, ladies, made into a diamond. Or you can shoot the cremated body out into space. Or you can send it to a desert island where it will be scattered there. All or some of the above you're able to do and make it a part of the procession. But I said earlier, you must consider unintended consequences. You say, Leon, what are you talking about? Well, let me tell you a couple of things. If you take the ashes and you put them into a wooden urn, and you take that wooden urn home and you place it on the fireplace, and then a couple of years later, your home, for whatever reason, catches fire and burns to the ground. What happens to that wooden urn? It burns up and the ashes are lost forever. We need to think about that when you're deciding what to do with the cremated body. About 3 years ago, up in the state of Minnesota, they had the most interesting thing happen. One of the gentlemen that lived there was a fisherman, and he fished out on the Great Lakes. And when he died, he told his family, I want my cremated body to be taken out into the Great Lake and dropped. And that way I'll spend all my eternity in my favorite fishing ground. So the family processes down to the lake. They get in a boat. They all go out on the water. Dad's in his urn, cremated. They throw him overboard. 2 years later, people are walking down the beach of this particular lake, and they find an urn. And so they call the police. The police come out. They open the urn up, and inside is his name and the name of the funeral home that did the cremation. They call the funeral home, and the funeral home goes to their records. They find the name of the next of kin, and they call them. Well, what do you say in that situation? Well, guess what? Dad's back. And so the family had to come down to the funeral home, and they had to do the same service over again. But this time they did something different. They took Dad's cremated body and placed it in an urn made out of salt. And then they went back out onto the Great Lake and they dumped Dad overboard. And then the salt gradually melts and Dad became a part of the lakes that he loved all of his life. But they had to go through this unintended consequence. And then, in my mind, the most unintended consequence of all is if you walk into any funeral home in America and you go to a back room, you'll find a row of shelves. And sitting on that row of shelves is urn after urn after urn filled with cremated bodies that the family has never came and picked up simply because they did not know what to do with them because the family did not leave them any instructions. You need to make sure that that does not happen with your family. So please give some serious thought to what you want done with your cremated body. So in summary, a healing cremation tribute contains 3 essential elements. Some form of a gathering, preferably public. A ceremony with religious or spiritual overtones, or one that honors the memory of the person who has died. And then finally, there's a procession to a place of final rest. And here's what's neat. You can have these in any order that you choose. So, let's go back to the question I asked you in the beginning. Which is right? Well, what's right in my mind is what reflects, first of all, your personal wishes. Secondly, provides what your family needs. And then finally, fits into your budget. You know, when I sit down with families to talk about the options available to them in cremation, there's 2 things I want to make sure of. I want to make sure, first of all, that they don't overspend on their cremation. Secondly, I want to make sure they don't underspend on their cremation, because either one of those can lead to regrets later on down the road. Now, you may be wondering, what's the funeral director's role in all of this? Well, first of all, his role is to provide options for your consideration, to provide guidance and advice based upon his own or her own personal experience. He will handle all the logistics. A lot of times there may be a lot of things to do, and in other situations there may be very little. But he will make sure that everything is done. He will make sure that the appropriate laws are followed. Basically, your funeral director serves like an orchestra leader. He makes sure that everything takes place in its proper timing. Here's what's important for you to know. This is your time to be cared for. You know, when a death occurs in your family, it's time for the family to quit being the caregiver and be the care receiver. And so you need to rely on your funeral director and the funeral home of your choice to make sure that you're taken care of in the way that you need to be taken care of. So rely on your funeral director. At this point in the program, people are starting to wonder, well, what might my cremation tribute cost? Well, every person's cost is as personal as their preferences. Depends on three things. First of all, what services you desire. Secondly, what merchandise is needed to carry out your plans. And then third, what third-party charges may be needed. Here's what we'd like to do. In order to help families get a better grip on all of these costs, what we'd like to do is sit down with each and every one of you and go through all of your preferences. Now, once we know what you prefer and what you want and we figure out what your family needs, then we can give you an estimate of what it will cost at today's price, and then we can decide what steps to take from there. Does that sound fair enough? Great. Then we'll look forward to talking with you.